Think about you as a person. What makes you you? Is it the heart? It's the legs? Your face? Actually, your personality, your dreams, your hopes, your emotions, what makes you you is just this. The brain, your nerves. The rest of all this stuff is really just like an organic case or a coating to keep this thing alive. You are your nervous system. You are your brain. Your brain is you. So in this video, we want to talk about you. We want to talk about the structure and function of the thing, the brain, that makes you who you are. Let's get started. So there are some organisms that don't really have a brain, right? So if you think about it, the brain had to evolve over time like everything else. That process is called cephalization. When you see the root cepha, you often think head, right? So cephalization is a clustering of neurons in the brain, right, or the front end of a bilaterally symmetrical animal. Well, why would a cluster of neurons start forming in that particular area? Well, we find out that's where a lot of the sense organs are as well. So your brain is clustered. It evolved by clustering neurons, neural cells, at the front anterior portion of organisms where the sense organs are. So let's start with showing how this evolution occurred with a cnidarian, right? Like a little sea anemone or something like that. They actually don't have a complex brain or nervous system. It's just kind of a nerve net, right? So it's got these neurons sort of in a net form scattered throughout. So a simple nervous system, no complex or control over anything. Then you can see something like an echinoderm, a starfish. They actually have a little more cluster and it's a little more defined with their nervous system, but it's still based on these nerve nets and does support a little more complex movement. So we're seeing some movement here where we didn't see there. Then if you look at a little more evolved, something like a flatworm, there are some nerve systems that move throughout, but we do start to see some definition, right? A more defined central nervous system that runs throughout, where we're starting to see a stronger collection or cluster of neurons near the anterior portion. Okay, then we could go on and on forever with crocodiles and fish and things like that. I want to show you then when we start to see actually brains develop. So if you look at a fish, there's a lot of hindbrain, right? The stuff in the back, not the more complex stuff in the front. Then we move to birds. We're seeing a little more forebrain right up here at the front. And then finally in humans, right, much forebrain and very little hindbrain. And we have a very dominant cerebrum up at the top. So the brain evolved over time by clustering more and more neurons closer to the front of the organism. So we're going to use the rest of this video to talk about then the human brain and its structure and function. So here is the structure of the human brain. This is a cut sort of right down the center. We're looking inside the brain. So if we took the brain like I have here, and we just cut right down the center, and you looked at one side, that's really what you're looking at in this picture. So let's start sort of up at the top and work our way around. So this outer part of the brain is the cerebrum, and we're looking here at the cerebral cortex, this outer part. This cortex, the cerebrum, is really associated with very sophisticated synthesis, right? This is where you're going to do your calculus and your philosophy. We see learning, emotion, memory, all in this sort of cerebral cortex area there. So what holds the two hemispheres together of the cerebrum is something called the corpus callosum. And this is what connects, this right here, connects the two hemispheres. So if you were to take my brain again and look at it, these top two parts of the cerebrum, this hemisphere and this hemisphere, actually are not connected up here at the top. They're connected, as you see right here, at the corpus callosum. So then let's continue moving down. So we got the cerebrum, we got the corpus callosum that connects the cerebrum. Then if you go down a little below, you have the hypothalamus, hypo meaning below, and you can actually see the thalamus there. We'll get to that in a minute. But the hypothalamus is all about homeostasis. So we call it the homeostatic control center. This is where we're going to really maintain that body temperature. We're going to maintain all those homeostatic mechanisms in the body, and it's going to influence what's right below it, the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland we typically think of as something that's in the endocrine system, in fact is known as the master gland because it impacts many other glands. It secretes lots of hormones that will then travel to other parts of the body and have them secrete some hormones. So that's the pituitary gland below the hypothalamus. And then we get to this sort of brain stem area here. Up at the top, right here below, sort of off to the side of the thalamus, is the midbrain. The midbrain is about integrating that sensory data, right? So the things you see, the things you hear, touch, and sending it up to the brain. Then if you go below that, we see the pons right there. The pons is all about breathing, okay? Very important structure in the brain. And then below that, we see the medulla oblongata, also involved in breathing, but also circulation and digestion. So if you think about it, this sort of hindbrain region that we're seeing back here, those were the first to evolve, if you remember looking at the previous slide. This stuff is super, super essential, right, for survival of any animal, okay? Up here, if you look at the cerebral cortex, right, this calculus and memory and emotion, that is important for us as humans, but not so important as an animal to survive necessarily. This stuff down here about sensory information, breathing, digestion, that's all essential. It's back here in the hindbrain that we see. Then let's move over to the spinal cord. So spinal cord is all about data to and from the brain centers, right? So we need to get data to, like if I touch something, I need to have that sensation sent to my brain, but then my brain decides, oh, you need to move, then that sensation might need to come back down the brain stem, the spinal cord, to get to my other peripheral nerves. So the spinal cord is really getting data to and from the brain centers. Then if we look at this back part, the cerebellum that you see there is all about body movement, right? Motor response. This is in the back hind part of the brain. I always like to comment on this. If you look deep in the cerebellum, you see this, how it kind of spreads out, kind of looks like a tree. We call that the arbor vitae, the tree of life, kind of resembles a tree. Moving up, we see the pineal gland. This is all about sleep patterns because it controls the production of melatonin. And you can see your pineal gland right there, right? It's starting to get a little busy here with all my drawings, but I think you can see that little pineal gland right there. And that's about melatonin production, sleep patterns. That's going to affect your wakefulness and things like that. Moving up to the thalamus, right there in the center, I like to think of the thalamus as like the control tower. If you go to an airport, right, you've got that control tower. It sees the planes coming in, the planes going out. It's kind of coordinating a lot of that. So sensory input, right, the things we see from our eyes, the smell, and then the motor output. Now this, we need to send a motor response down to get some action to happen. Okay, so that's an overview of the structure of different anatomical things in the brain. Not important that you necessarily memorize every single thing and how it works, but just have a general understanding of what some of the different structures do and some of their roles in the brain. Now, this is a very simplistic, very few word description of what these structures do. It's actually much more complicated, but this is a good starting place for you to start to understand some of the brain anatomy. So let's move then to the cerebrum, right? This is what makes humans very different than other animals, is that we have these really evolved big cerebrums that are highly folded, lots of connections. So the cerebrum is the most highly evolved structure of the mammalian brain. And you can see, if we look here at a superior view, we're looking on top of the brain, you can see right down the center that the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, right? So we're looking at the patient's left and right. So this would be the left and the right hemisphere. Now, I already mentioned the connection between these two is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is what connects the left and right hemisphere at this point. This is a sagittal cut, right? So right down the center, we've cut, again, we took our knife and we just cut right down, and then we're looking at one side. And that's what you see here is a sagittal cut. And that corpus callosum is important because it allows these two hemispheres to communicate. We know different things happen in different hemispheres, so it's important that the hemispheres are able to communicate. And they do that through the corpus callosum. So we also know that the cerebrum, right, that most evolved part of the animal or mammalian brain, is very specialized. And in fact, different regions have different functions. So here we want to talk about these regions or lobes of the cerebrum, okay? So get your bearings here. We're talking about the cerebrum. We're not talking about this part back here. We're talking about this cerebrum here. That cerebrum has different lobes. So let's start with the frontal lobe, all right? So here's the front of the person. Here's the back of the person, right? Here's the front. So that makes sense that this is the frontal lobe. So what happens up here, right? Lots of executive functioning. These things that we're able to plan, to carry things out, thinking, problem solving, and a lot of our personality we find is also up here in the frontal lobe. If we go over here and we move back a little, the parietal lobe is often involved in perception, a little arithmetic, spelling, right? Some of those things that's involved in our knowledge comprehension we see there in the parietal lobe. And I've color-coded these so you see the color corresponds. Then the temporal lobe, if you think right by your temples, that's where you would get the closest to your temporal lobe. Well, your temples, what's close? Oh, the ears, right? So when we're thinking about language comprehension, understanding, memory, a lot of that takes place here in the temporal lobe. Moving back, we get to the occipital lobe, and that's a occipital. Looks like I covered it up there. But that's really responsible for vision. The way I remember this is CC. Oh, I see, right? Vision, you see things. And that's at the back. Why would if the eyes are up here, right? Well, they're not in the brain, but right. If the eyes are up here, why is this part of the brain responsible for vision? Well, we actually know some of these ocular nerves kind of go right back here. So vision is primarily specialized in the occipital lobe. Okay, moving on to another part of the cerebrum. There's a region of the cerebrum called the motor cortex that's really all about voluntary movement. So when I decide to move my hand back and forth like this, right, that's a voluntary thing. That originates here in this part of the cerebrum called the primary motor cortex. So if you look at it from a lateral view from the side, there it kind of comes down. But if you look at it after we've cut it, right, the mid-sagittal view, inside we're really looking at this area that comes down about this high from the brain, from the top of the brain. Well, what happens in the motor cortex? Well, this is sending sensory information for these voluntary movements. And we actually have tracked it even more. So if you take that section and blow it up here, right, this is what we call a coronal view. Different parts respond to different motor abilities in different parts. So I'm talking, right? So my face is moving. So that is actually this section of the motor cortex is responsible for that. And we know a lot of this is mapped to different parts of the brain because when people have certain injuries or they have certain problems with being able to control these things, we can see some damage in certain parts of this motor cortex. So the lower extremities is really here. You get to the trunk of the body. Upper extremities is controlled here. Face, and then you move down to sort of digestion and things. That's controlled from different areas. But pretty cool to think we know all these things we can move where a lot of that motor cortex is involved in those specific abilities to move things. Okay, now stuff that's a little more complicated, right? We're pretty good at knowing what part of the brain controls arms and hands and things like that. But controlling emotion, behavior, memory, that stuff's a lot harder. So we grouped a lot of this into what we call the limbic system. Limbic kind of means on the border. So this is sort of parts that are on the border there around the cerebrum. And this mediates basic emotions, fear, anger, right? It's also your behavior. We know the limbic system is also involved in emotional bonds, these bonds that we create emotionally with people, and in establishing our mood. So what are the structures involved in the limbic system? Well, as you can see here, I've highlighted a few. So we got our cerebrum up here, right? We just talked about that in the specialization. We want to go a little deeper to get to the limbic system. So this sort of salmon-colored area is called the cingulate gyrus, and that's linking motivational outcome to behavior. So this is processing emotion, and this links it, right? You've done all the processing, but now you need to have some behavior as a result. And we know cingulate gyrus is really responsible for linking those two, our motivation, to actually behaving in a certain way. Oh, I know my motivation is that I should go and do some jumping jacks or do some exercise, but is my behavior there? Is it linked to it? We find that the cingulate gyrus is often damaged in people with schizophrenia. These are folks that see delusions, hallucinations, and so they have a lot of damage in this area, and they often see and hear things maybe that aren't there. So moving down, the hypothalamus, we've already mentioned. This is maybe a center, right? Sort of this purple color here. Center for the limbic system. It helps regulate. Remember, we talked about this being involved in homeostasis. So moving down a little bit to the amygdala, we see there. You hear amygdala talked a lot about in psychology because, you know, it's about emotion and memory and behavior. And this is involved in decision making, recognizing emotional memory, and then facial expression. So the amygdala really responsible in some of these decisions we make based on our emotions and our memory. And it's also involved in recognizing people's faces. That's why some people are maybe perhaps better at recognizing faces than others, right? The brain has to pretty quickly be able to recognize a face to see if it is potential danger, right? That's from years of evolution. So we are good at recognizing different faces and even seeing small little details in facial expression. And then finally, the hippocampus, really involved in memory. So those of us that study education and learning and what's the best way to learn and cognitively think, we're going to study the hippocampus a lot because that particular structure in the brain is really involved in learning and memory. Okay? So limbic system, it has a few more structures. We're not going to go super in depth into this, but these are some of the basic structures that we're going to see involved in the limbic system. Okay, now that we've talked about the different structures in the brain, how does information get to the brain? Okay, well, we need some sensory receptors. So we find in attached to a lot of our peripheral nerves, right, peripheral things like our eyes, our mouth, our nose, our hands, we have these receptors that sense things and then can send it to the brain. So there's 4 different types I want to go over. The first one is mechanoreceptors. Think of it sort of like a mechanical thing, right? So if you were touched or you get pressure or sound waves, right? Those are mechanoreceptors because there's some physical stimuli, pressure, touch, sound, that's actually activating these mechanoreceptors. Now, where do we have those? Well, we've got them all over, right? Touch, feel, sound. We've got mechanoreceptors, okay? We also, the next one is thermoreceptors. So if you get really hot, like this chef is here getting to the stove, right? You've got receptors that can detect heat or cold, and those help to maintain body temperature. So that's a different type of receptors, thermoreceptors, all about temperature. Chemoreceptors, we see a lot in humans, but we also see this a lot in other animals. Animals and even other organisms like plants have a lot of chemoreceptors, receptors that respond to different chemicals. Well, an obvious one is, right, your tongue receptors, the different receptors on your tongue that can detect certain chemicals. So when you taste something really salty or something really sweet, you're tasting glucose or sodium chloride, you've got different receptors on the tongue that transmit the information about that chemical and then send it to the brain, so your brain says, oh, that's salty or that's sweetie. It's really just a chemical binding to a particular receptor. And then the last one I want to talk about is electromagnetic receptors. So when you think of things on the electromagnetic spectrum like light, photoreceptors for us to be able to see. There's actually in this snake, there's some infrared receptors that they can actually use a different frequency on the electromagnetic spectrum. They can see infrared, and they have those receptors there. They're also electromagnetic receptors, okay? So you've got the mechanical ones like touch, you've got thermo, about heat and cold, chemo, different chemicals like on the tongue, and then electromagnetic receptors, wavelengths of light, photoreceptors, or infrared receptors like we see in that scary little snake there. Okay, as we start to wrap it up, we've talked a lot about how information travels throughout the nervous system. I want to give you an example of the simplest nerve circuit. Even though this particular video is about the brain, we actually occasionally bypass the brain altogether. And that's called a reflex arc. So for example, if you go to touch some fire here on this purple candle, I'm not sure why it's purple, but you touch this purple candle, your brain doesn't really need to be involved in that response, right? This is an evolutionary adaptation called a reflex arc or an automatic response. If you're being burned, you need to immediately move your hand away, move the finger away from that burning flame and protect your skin, protect your body. So what happens in this reflex arc is we see these rapid responses because the signal only goes to the spinal cord. We know in the spinal cord we actually have lots of neurons. See all that matter there? Those neurons in the spinal cord. So those neurons can make the decision for us that we need to move our hand. We don't have to go up to the brain and involve the brain in that at all. So what happens here, as you can see, if you've got a flame, right, you touch it, all right, you've got some sensory neurons. Those are going to send into your body. They're going to go to the spinal cord. The spinal cord's going to make a quick decision to send down to a motor neuron, make that muscle move, reflex, get that finger off of that flame, right? When you go to the doctor's office and take the little hammer and they hit your knee, same sort of deal. They're testing your reflexes to see if your reflexes are working. So this has a pretty strong adaptive value. These are essential actions. If something was coming straight to your eye, right, you'd blink automatically. That doesn't have to go to the brain. That's an essential reflex arc that you see. Things like balance, pupil dilation, being startled, a lot of those are show adaptive value because they're quick little simple nerve circuits. Okay, last thing I want to mention, we've talked a lot about the brain, but the brain, because it's so special, because it's you, because it's so essential, we need to be able to protect the brain. So the body evolved something called the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is this highly selective, right? Highly selective. It selects only certain things. And it's semipermeable. You remember that from membranes, right? Semipermeable. Only a few things that are selected can permeate through the cells to get into the brain. So this prevents some solutes from passing into the central nervous system or the brain, and it also prevents most pathogens, right? If you get a bad infection, you get a fungal infection, or you get a bacterial or viral infection, we don't really want that getting into the brain. So most pathogens can be prevented from getting into the brain from this blood-brain barrier. So again, if you look at sort of a sagittal cut of the brain, and we look at one little area, right, you see all these arteries, right, all these veins in the brain. What we see here is that, your brain needs blood. You're right, use a lot of ATP, so we got to get that glucose. We got to get the essential things that the brain needs to the brain. So of course they're going to come down through the circulatory system, but other things like pathogens can come down the circulatory system too. So we don't want those things to get into the brain. So if this is your blood vessel, right, you see it right here, there is this barrier of endothelial cells there that protects the brain that you see there and there from these nasty pathogens. Here, let me draw a nasty pathogen. Oh, mean pathogen. It can't get in there often, most of them, because of this blood-brain barrier. Now, why do I mention this? Well, it actually becomes quite important because as we try to treat issues in the brain, often you can't just take a quick pill. Why? Because some of those chemicals, those solutes, don't actually pass the blood-brain barrier. So part of making medicines or drugs or trying to treat issues in the brain is we have to come up with something that can actually bypass that blood-brain barrier, right? This thing that evolved to protect us actually sometimes prevents us from treating some of the issues we want to treat. Okay, so hopefully this was a really good overview of different brain structures and functions, and you have sort of started to get a general understanding of this very complex and dynamic organ that we all have that makes us who we are.